My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about a brief little episode that happens near the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, which I had never really paid a whole lot of attention to until the Tolkien professor mentioned it in one of his Exploring the Lord of the Rings classes, because it's an episode with Sam in a pub talking to Ted Sandyman, and he mentions tree men or giants seen in the North Moors, and when he mentioned this, I don't know why. For some reason, every time I've read the book, it just kind of passed me by. But when he mentioned it out loud in the audio, even before he kind of went down the path of, was this an Ent, it struck me, could that have been an Ent? Uh, don't know why I never thought of it before, but at any rate, let's explore why it might be and why it might not be an Ent, and see if we can come to a conclusion. So to set the stage, Sam is talking to Ted Sandyman in the pub, and he's talking about strange things that have been going on in the Shire and around the Shire. And one of the things he says is, well, what about these tree men or giants, as you might call them? They do say one was seen bigger than a tree back up, around the North Moors not too long ago. And Ted Sandyman and him have a little bit of back and forth, and some of the details that we can kind of pick up are that it was seen by, for one person at least, Sam's cousin Hal, who Ted Sandyman thinks is always seeing things that aren't there, which, makes you wonder what the credibility level is. And no other witnesses are brought up, so, there's another issue. We'll get to that later. But one of the things that he said was it was, like an elm tree, but walking, and there's no elm trees up in that part of the country. And it said that its stride was 7 yards if it was an inch, and to which Ted Sandyman says, and I bet it wasn't an inch. Ted Sandyman is basically steadfastly refusing to believe in anything out of the normal in the entire conversation, quite apart from the tree men. So anyway, that's kind of the situation that gets us going. So the question is, what do we know about Ents, and what do we know about giants, and what can we figure out from what was seen in this particular event, if anything was seen at all, to let us know one way or the other what it is? First, I think we can rule out it's not a troll. Hobbits seem to know what trolls are like, because when Bilbo first encounters them in The Hobbit, he seems to know what trolls are. Bilbo has told stories about trolls. Presumably lots of hobbits would be familiar with the idea of what trolls are. I think we can rule out the idea that it's a troll. That basically leaves the two options. Is it a giant or is it an Ent? Now, you might be inclined to just dismiss the idea of a giant immediately because, well, there's no giants in Middle-earth. We don't hear about giants, but yes, we do. In The Hobbit, we do, because in The Hobbit, when they're crossing the Misty Mountains, they have a very brief reference to there's a thunder battle going on between stone giants living in the Misty Mountains. We don't learn much of anything about the stone giants, what they are, where they come from, how big they are, much of anything. But we do know from that passage that in Middle-earth there are such things as giants, and presumably they are not the same thing as trolls, or they would have used that word. So the two possibilities basically are still on the table, Ents and giants. So let's figure out what we know about Ents and see what we can figure out to compare with this story. Of course, one of the things that we know about Ents is, well, everything we know about Ents really comes from the Two Towers, practically. Everything we know about Ents is a general class. Practically everything that we know about Ents is actually from the Two Towers, because we really only get like a couple of brief things in Return of the King, and very little at all in the Silmarillion. But in the Two Towers, we do learn several things. When Merry and Pippin first meet Treebeard, it says that he is at least 14 feet high, and that when they go to the Ent Moot, they find out that there are a huge variety of Ents. I mean, there's basically different Ents for every different type of tree you could imagine. The fir tree Ents, it tells us, are the tallest, which kind of makes sense. Fir trees can get really tall, upwards of 200 feet. If you actually look at it, they don't always get that tall, just, that's the upper range. And elm trees can also get pretty tall, and since this particular thing that was seen was supposed to be like an elm tree, could be really tall. And this is important because when Sam says that its stride was 7 yards, I mean, that's 21 feet. That's a huge stride. And if you assume that Ent strides are at least kind of like human strides in that you're typically walking somewhere between, say, 30 to 55% of your height in your stride, unless you're really stretching your legs. That would imply that the thing in question is enormously tall. We're talking probably 40 feet or higher at least. So the question is, can Ents get that tall? We know that Treebeard is at least 14, which implies that he's probably less than 20, because then why would you stop at 14? But when they go to the Ent mood, it tells us that Merry and Pippin observe a huge variety not only in height, but in leg length, which implies that perhaps the proportion of leg to torso could actually be very different, which means, if you have even a not so hugely tall Ent, you might have long enough legs that it could make up for that and still be a really long stride. Not really, we don't get any upper ranges or lower ranges or anything like that. But it does say that the variance is pretty significant. And it kind of, you get the idea too that practically everything about Ents varies pretty significantly. For example, some of them have 9 toes. Although what a toe on an Ent would look like, I'm not exactly sure. But at any rate, the point is, the variance is really, really great. So it certainly is possible that there could be an Ent with a stride that is 7 yards long. It would be either have to be a really tall Ent or a fairly tall Ent with really long legs, but I don't see a reason to foreclose it as a possibility outright. Now, for what it's worth, a Tolkien professor, and I should mention this, Dr. Coriolton, he thinks it is an Ent, and it's really interesting. I mean, you'd have to listen to his discussion to get all the rationale. I'm a little bit more reticent to think that it's an Ent because it seems just a little weird that an Ent could have made it all the way from Fangorn all the way up to the Shire and have been not stopped at some point. I mean, like, how do you get all the way there and there's not like stories going around everywhere? But then you think about it. What kind of territory would an Ent have to cross to get from Fangorn to the Shire? Once you get past the Gap of Rohan, or if you just climbed over the mountains, you wouldn't even have to do that. And yes, Ent could climb, over the mountains at some point, I suppose. But most of the territory west of the Misty Mountains is pretty empty. For example, we know that Eregion, or Holland, as it's called in the Western, which is the realm of the elves that was, just outside the west gate of Moria, is basically deserted because that elf kingdom was destroyed way back when. The regions around it are also pretty empty. When the Fellowship is traveling south from Rivendell down to basically the gate of Moria, they really don't encounter anything. All of that is empty land, basically. So it's unsettled. It's not implausible that you could get an Ent all the way up there. The only question is, why would there be an Ent up there? I mean, it just seems a little weird, right? We do get conversations between Merry and Pippin where they're describing the Shire, and Treebeard says, that sounds like a kind of place that the Entwives might like. And then later, of course, he tells them, keep an eye out when you go back for any Entwives. Now, was this thing that we saw an Entwife? Probably not. The implication, here's one area where I do agree with the Tolkien professor. I don't remember where he said this. I think it's in a different place, but it might be the same episode. But at any rate, he theorizes that the Entwives are gone. I mean, they had mostly been to the east, where if you look on the map of Middle Earth, there's the Brown Lands. That's where they had their gardens, and then Sauron basically blasted all that, and it's a wasteland. But the theory is because of that the Entwives are probably all dead, unfortunately. And Treebeard even says, I don't think we'll ever meet again unless it be, at the end, the very end of the history of the world. So it doesn't seem likely that it would be an Entwife. So what else could it be? The fact that Sam specifically says tree men, or giants as you might call them, suggests that it looks like a tree, and of course he says it looks like an elm, seems pretty strongly to hint that it really is an Ent. The question is, why would an Ent go all that way? Could the Ent be looking for the Entwives? Could the Ent just be looking for better places to live that aren't right next door to Saruman, who's trying to kill all the trees? that seems slightly less likely just because Saruman at that stage hadn't gotten quite that far into it, or at least we don't get the idea. It's kind of hard to tell really from the narrative because Gandalf, wakes up on the top of the tower, looks down, and everything's just a disaster from that perspective. And it's not clear if he just missed it when he came to Isengard initially, or if it happened overnight. It's really not made clear. But Saruman has definitely been at work for some time by the time Merry and Pippin get there, but that's months and months and months after the conversation that Sam has with Ted Sandyman. And so it's entirely possible that nothing has started then, but maybe it did. And so it could be an Ent is just literally trying to find a homier place to set up rather than staying where, Saruman is trying to cut down all the trees. So we can imagine reasons why an Ent might go. And it's, if you look at the maps, it would kind of make sense that they would just keep going too, because all that region that's kind of empty, there's not a whole lot of forest there either, because it was at one time cleared and settled land. So if this is an Ent, he's naturally going to look for a forest, which means he's going to keep going until he finds one. And, the Shire seems about as likely a place to stop as any. If he had wandered a little further to the east, he might have ended up in the Chetwood around Bree and Archet and all those little towns. At any rate, that's kind of the most information we can really get out of any of this, and on balance, I think I have to agree with the Tolkien professor that the most likely explanation is that it really is an Ent. There's just that little part of my brain that really doesn't like the idea of an Ent traveling all the way from Fangorn up to the Shire. It just seems so weird. But, if you have any other ideas for reasons why it probably is or probably isn't an Ent, or if you can come up with an alternate explanation, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. So, hope you enjoyed that video. It is definitely an interesting comment that we get at the very beginning, and probably the reason I overlooked it so many times is because you do get it right up front before you ever get to, the Ents and what they're about, and so you just kind of skip over it the next time and the next time, and then you finally realize, wait a minute, what is he talking about? But anyway, it's a really interesting thing to think about, just what is this thing that was seen? Now, of course, you could just blow it off and say that Sam's cousin is seeing things, but that's too boring. Let's not do that. At any rate, if you did like the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRT for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia, and you can, of course, subscribe to the channel over here. Don't forget to click that bell icon. You can support me over here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.